Hello and welcome to March's ECR Wednesday webinar hosted by eLife, the series that aims to give early career researchers a platform to discuss issues important to you in your research career. My name's Emma, and as you're going to learn, I work for the eLife Features team. And today, as well as doing this usual introductory part, I'll also be one of the speakers on our panel discussing careers outside academia. The webinar will begin with us sharing our stories. Then, in the second half of the webinar, we'll be putting your questions to us. To ask a question, you can type in the question box on the GoToWebinar Functions panel, or you can tweet us, we are at eLife Community, using the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Please also join us on Twitter immediately after the webinar, where we'll be continuing the discussion under the ECR Wednesday hashtag. Today's chat will be moderated by Vinod from the eLife Early Career Advisory Group. Finally, I'd just like to let you know that we are recording the webinar and will make it available on YouTube in the near future. Now I'll pass over to Indrani to introduce the panelists.
Hi, so I'm Indrani. I am a science editor at Jove, and today we'll be talking about the alternate career paths that are available to recent PhDs. And today I'm really fortunate to have three other amazing scientists with me who have chosen alternate careers themselves. So first up, we have Emma, who just introduced herself and the webinar to everybody. She's a features editor at eLife. And we have Ribu, who will be joining us. She is an immunologist and a senior scientist at KSQ Therapeutics. We have Ben, who went into a very different direction with patent law. So I think that wraps up introductions for everybody. But what I would like to start off the discussion with is just a short, a brief introduction that we can all give about ourselves, in which we kind of talk about what made us choose this current career path and how exactly did we break into this role. So I can go first, and I'll then hand off the mic to Emma, Ribu, and then Ben. So I finished up my PhD a few years ago at Dartmouth, and I did a short postdoc at Dartmouth again. And during that time, I realized that my interests actually laid somewhere outside of academia, or outside of the traditional path of academia. I realized that as much as I loved science, I was more interested in reading about it and kind of dissecting the little bits in my head rather than pipetting, let's say. So one of the things that I did during my time in grad school was I actually signed up for an online writing and editing course at Coursera. And that introduced me to the concept of editing and reviewing of manuscripts. And I really fell in love with that. I really enjoyed it. Apart from that, I've always been kind of interested in scientific writing, per se. So that was another one of my checkboxes that got ticked in this current career. So when I was looking for careers outside of academia, I came across editors and the many different roles that editors can do. So I applied for many different editorial positions, and one of the things, the one that I ended up choosing me and me choosing them is a science editor position at Jove. And in this position, what my editorial duties mainly entail is speaking to a lot of different scientists, which is awesome. And I get to talk to them about their different research questions they're tackling in the lab, the different techniques that they have up and running in the lab. And once we can hash out a technique that would fit in with our journal, the manuscript comes in, and I then make sure that it fits with our format, the scope of the journal, and manage it through the peer review process. And apart from that, being an editor also gives me an insight into other aspects of publishing that I didn't have, I didn't even know were available to me before I joined in this position. been involved in a lot of marketing and writing, and I'm enjoying all of that. So with that, I'll just hand over the reins to Emma, who will tell us a little more about what brought her into publishing.
Yes, thank you. So I have to admit, I didn't initially set out to be an editor. Although I do love what I do now. So my job now, I'm not involved in the reviewing of manuscripts. I sort of help to write, edit, and commission what we call the magazine content at eLife. So this is things like feature articles, the insights, the eLife Digest, the plain language summaries that appear in research articles. And I'm also in charge of the stuff that appears on the eLife community page, and thinking of new ideas for what might be of interest to early career researchers, such as we did a very relevant series of interviews to this webinar called Working Lives that looked at people with PhDs who have since gone into careers outside of academia. And that was a lot of fun to sort of develop and perform those interviews. So I've been here for about 4 years now, and I was originally doing a PhD in material science. And I realised probably within the first year that I didn't want to stay in research. And then over the following year, I realised that the parts of my day that I enjoyed most were the days where I was going off to local primary schools to do some outreach activities with them. And so I thought, well, why not look into doing a career in science communication? And at this point, I was thinking very much sort of face-to-face type communication work. But I didn't really know sort of what jobs were actually available in that kind of area. So I started looking at job adverts online to see what skills they were looking for, to work out sort of how the skills that I had might meet their requirements, and also to sort of see what I might be missing. And one thing that I was missing that a lot of these jobs were looking for was the ability to demonstrate that you can write about science to lots of different audiences. And so I went out and I thought, okay, let's get some experience. And the great thing about, well, if you're interested in a career in writing or editing and you're a researcher, is that it's really easy to get experience in a huge number of ways. You can, for example, you can write a blog or contribute to someone else's blog, and there are lots of people on the features team at eLife who started out that way. If you've got student magazines or newspapers at your institute, that's a great way to get involved both in writing and get some editing experience. Department newsletters, thinking bigger as well. Don't be afraid to sort of pitch articles to editors of like national magazines and journals, because we love to receive submissions from new people, although it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be able to publish them. But not that scary, honest, either. The route I chose was to enter science writing competitions. My thought being that if I could sort of do one on one of these, it would look, sort of help my CV to stand out for other people. High-risk strategy, I wouldn't recommend that you rely entirely on that, although if you do enter a competition and you're and you don't win, then you can always repurpose your entry as a blog post. I'd highly recommend you do that. And I entered a competition called Access to Understanding, which unfortunately doesn't run anymore, but it basically you had to write a lay summary of a research article. It's very similar to the job I actually now do, and I happened to win it. At which point I thought, well, maybe I should go into a writing career instead. And at this point, I still wasn't really thinking about editing. I wanted to be a journalist. My plan was to finish my PhD and then maybe do some internships, maybe do a journalism course and go that way. But then someone spotted an advert for a job at eLife as an assistant features editor and thought, well, this is a job where you get to write lay summaries of papers. Sounds like it'd be a perfect fit for you, Emma. And I looked at it and I thought, well, this is my dream job. But even then, I still almost didn't apply because I looked at the requirements and I thought, well, I don't meet all of these. They're not going to employ me. I don't have any editing experience. They also wanted a PhD in a biological subject, which I didn't have. But I thought, what have I got to lose? And I applied anyway. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to get the job. So if I can sort of give like one piece of advice, I suppose, to any one of you who is thinking of investigating an alternative career, it's really do apply for jobs, get to know the field, and never hold yourself back. The only way you can guarantee that you won't get a job is if you don't apply for it at all.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Emma. Ruby, do you want to go next?
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Ribhu Nair. I'm a senior scientist at KSQ Therapeutics. So my career path was actually pretty straightforward. I wanted to be a scientist as far as I can remember, and I loved immunology. So I went to grad school where I studied T cell responses to infection as well as T cell development. It was really great because I could see a direct applicability of this work to health and disease. And then I went for my postdoc where I was looking at how cardiovascular diseases affect the development of the immune system. But while I was doing these studies, it became very clear to me that there's a long gap between doing basic research and being able to take it to clinic. And I came into science to make a drug or a vaccine and help people out. And so then I started talking to people who were, young professors in academia or people outside the industry who were doing bench research to really understand where I wanted to take my career and my interest. And I realized that if I wanted to make a drug and work on a drug discovery project, then if I moved to the industry, I had a higher probability of doing that. And that's when I really, made the decision to leave my academic research behind and go towards a company where I could be involved in these studies. And so here I'm at KSV Therapeutics and enjoying my life.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Ben, do you want to go next, please?
Hi, yes, thanks, and Johnny. My name's Ben Tolley. I'm a bit different from the other participants. I'm a European patent attorney at FR Kelly in Dublin. My technical background is in molecular biology. So I did a PhD in plant molecular biology at the University of Cambridge, and then I trained as a patent attorney at a London IP practice for 5 years, and have very recently moved to FR Kelly in Dublin. Now I got into the career because I really wanted a clear career progression, but also I primarily wanted to learn a different set of skills from those that I'd learned in the lab. But I also wanted to use my scientific training, so it was a fairly specific set of requirements. But I wanted to use it in a practical setting. I also realised I really loved research, but and I really enjoyed the technical depth of my PhD, but my attention span's not great, and I really missed the variety of my undergraduate degree, being able to dip in and out of different topics. And so I wanted to combine the technical depth of the PhD with a variety of subjects, and that's kind of borne out in my choice as a patent attorney, I guess, because as a European patent attorney, I work with a range of clients, primarily in the life sciences area, and they range from multinational corporations and SMEs through to universities and spin-outs. And what I do is I help those clients to protect and develop and maximize the value of their research. And so that includes helping clients to develop an intellectual property strategy which supports their commercial requirements, drafting and prosecuting UK, European and international patent applications for a broad range of biotech subject matter, arguing the case with examiners from patent offices across the world to get the best protection for whoever my client is for their technology, and also defending their patents against attack from competitors or attacking the patents of their competitors in oral proceedings which are held at the European Patent Office in Munich or The Hague in order to allow the client to scope to work commercially. So it's an extremely stimulating career. I feel intellectually pushed most days, and I'm learning all the time, whether that's about the latest technologies or developments in the law, or whether it's aspects of client management or commercial or legal strategy. And I use my scientific background all the time. It's necessary to talk with clients quite frequently about the developments in their technology and to understand it. You'll almost never exactly use your specific knowledge developed in a PhD, but understanding of the science is critical to doing it well. And I think that the clincher for me was essentially, in this job, you get paid to argue, which I think is fantastic. I mean, now I was a particularly argumentative child, so I love a good argument. And I think my parents would probably tell you that I grew up doing pretty much nothing else. So it's quite lucky because that's kind of half the job, really. So whether you're arguing with an examiner over whether a patent should be granted in the first place, or whether you're arguing with other attorneys representing other clients at opposition proceedings. A large part of the job is essentially being able to argue logically. A large part of my practice in particular is these days is opposition work. So you really have to be quite strategic and think on your feet, which I personally find, exhilarating. So, but I appreciate that might terrify other people. So it's probably good to think about beforehand. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. That was very informative, especially for all the logical, argumentative people out there. So, one of the questions that I've gotten a lot in the past, and I would like everybody to kind of weigh in on this, is how important is your publication profile in your chosen career path? So, for me as a science editor, it did make a difference because it did make they did like the fact that I've been on both sides of I would be on both sides of the table. It makes sense for somebody who's gone through the publication process to have a better idea of what to do during the review process. So in my case, I would say that it definitely did play a role. Maybe not the biggest role, but it did play a role in to be a science editor. Emma, do you have something to add there?
So in my case, it wasn't so much my publication that counted, but it was, again, I think having research experience and I guess sort of because a lot of my work is about sort of translating a research paper and summarizing it. So knowing how to read a research article was valuable. Again, like the subject knowledge wasn't so important. I was a material scientist and I now work in biology. But I did sort of have to prove myself that I could sort of catch up with all the sort of biology terminology as well.
Was it important for your position at KSQ?
I think, research papers in general are very important. They highlight a few things. They are a unit of productivity during your grad school and postdoc. They show your ability to take a project start to end. And if you have publications from multiple experiences like grad school and postdoc, they also reflect your ability to be successful in different environments and taking something, an idea, and figuring out the mechanism and taking it to fruition. So I think to some extent, yes, they're very important, but it's also important to bear in mind your situation. And if you think that you're not going to get a paper out of your postdoc or grad school, it's very important to start thinking early on that how are you going to find your next position, keeping that at the back of your mind and not stay in your current position for many, many years to come in the hope that you may get a paper.
And what about patent law?
Yes, I'd echo what some of the other participants have just said there. I'm not sure it was a huge part of the application process in terms of actually, having published any papers. I mean, as it happened, I had, but I'm not sure it was determinative of whether you were successful in the application process. I think it was more about, being aware of what the content of the paper was, what the requirements of research and the standards were to achieve a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Being able to look at data in a particular way and being able to analyze it, and how you might present that and how you might present arguments around that as well. I think was probably the most important aspect of the application process that related to publications, at least. Certainly when I applied, I was asked quite a bit about the research projects that I'd carried out in quite a lot of detail, actually, and I was required to talk about those in quite a serious amount of depth. So I would say at least having been through the publication and the peer review process kind of helped me do that, I suppose.
So that kind of brings me to another, well, I think we all kind of answered that, but is it better to have in-depth knowledge of a field or a broad overview of many different areas of research? So, I mean, I would probably vote for a broad overview of many different areas of research. I think it helps, like Ben said, it helps to be able to kind of analyze the research and the data presented in a paper rather than being the specialist in that one tiny area of research. But Dribu, do you have something else to add then?
I mean, I think it will depend on the position you're applying for. If the company is looking to hire somebody who has a certain skill set, then I think it's great if you have that skill set and that would, and you're a perfect fit to do that job. That increases your chances, I think, to get hired than somebody who doesn't know how to do it. So I think it would depend on the type of job you're applying for.
Emma, did you feel like having a broad overview of different areas of research or having a very selective, but very specialized knowledge, would that be helpful in your position?
I mean, it can be helpful if you sort of, let's say you're writing a summary of a paper and it's, they can be very technical. It can help if you have some knowledge of actually what's written to help you sort of more quickly digest the paper. But I also felt it was an advantage for me coming in as kind of an outsider, because I knew it was much more easy for me to know what level of understanding a non-scientist would have. So when writing these sort of broader articles, because I was basically writing them so I could understand them. And it's sort of been quite helpful for me to be able to hold on to that as I sort of learned more about biology and actually, got to grips with the field.
Yeah, so I think ultimately it will depend on the position you're applying for. So if the position requires you to have a broad knowledge of different fields or to be able to look at those data and interpret it, then it may be good to have broad knowledge. And if you're applying for specific positions that require you to have very in-depth knowledge, then it would work that way.
Then did either of these factors, was it an advantage for you when you were looking at your position?
I think, to be honest, I think the most important thing, particularly for my job at the moment, is an ability to understand topics quickly and get to the technical detail quickly. I mean, I'm probably on a day-to-day basis, I'm probably handling on average about 4 or 5 different types of patent application during the day, or types of technology. So an ability to, but you're under time pressure. So you're often the client hasn't got infinite funds, so you're under time, and your time, I guess, is relatively expensive for them. So they're asking you for your advice on a particular topic. So they want you to be able to get on top of the topic and to the particular issues at hand very quickly, and then be able to come out of that and then go into another completely separate technology and be able to get on top of that quickly as well. So, and see where the issues are. So I think from my perspective, yes, I think a broad kind of my undergraduate degree was very broad. It was in biology generally, and I think that's helped. But I think more than anything, it's an ability just to be able to understand things quickly and to ask the relevant questions. I think that was probably more decisive.
So this is a question which I think is interesting for most people out there. It's how exactly did you break into this role? Like, what were the steps you took? What were the resources you used? And I think Emma actually talked a little bit about what she did during her time when she was still kind of like on the path to her dream job. So, I mean, I would just like to know what were the different resources that all of us used to get where we are today. So, Emma, do you want to tell us a little more about the exact way in which you broke into this current position? I know you just mentioned that it just came up.
But... it's kind of hard for me to say how I broke in exactly, because it was, for me, it was kind of fortuitous, and it was someone I knew telling me about the job. This is before I started writing up my PhD thesis, so I hadn't even started like properly investigating how to get into the field. One thing I suppose I should say is sort of how the actual job application process works. So this is kind of your standard your standard application where you send in a cover letter and a CV. But the other important part of it is the writing sample. So in many writer and editor jobs, you'll be asked to provide a writing sample. It'll often be a sort of specifically not an academic writing sample to show that you can write for a broad audience. And I think that's the thing to really kind of concentrate on if you are interested in this field, sort of getting a really nice little sample in place. It doesn't have to be a published sample, although I think that helps as well if you can sort of say that it has been sort of, given a stamp of approval by another editor somewhere.
I'm glad you brought up the writing sample. So that was actually something that was part of my job interview process as well. I had to provide a writing sample, and I also had to review and edit a sample manuscript. So that was, again, one of the ways in which I kind of broke into this role, because, and apart from that, like I'd mentioned, there was some coursework that I'd done related to writing and editing, which also kind of made my resume a little stronger when they were considering different people for this role. But I'm sure the process is different for different positions. So, Ribu, you want to tell us about your journey?
Yeah, so when I started thinking about moving out of academia into industry, I reached out to a lot of people, were fellow graduate students who had made the transition, people I met at networking events, and sometimes just cold emails, trying to understand what was the industry like, what did it take to get in there. And MGH also, where I was a postdoc, had a lot of events where they would have career panel discussions or networking events, or you could visit a company with them. So that gave you like an insight into what a career in industry could look like. So that's how I got started. And then I met with a lot of people. I applied for a lot of jobs online. There are a lot of recruiters also who are there you could reach out to, and they can help you match to the right position. And I would say a big part of breaking into the new career would be to network with people who are already in the industry.
Then you had very specific requirements when you went job hunting. So could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, well, actually, that's an interesting point. So the specific requirements actually came from, I actually decided to, I was just finished the PhD, and I'd kind of, I was talking to various labs I think mostly in America about potential postdoc positions. And I just decided, I think at that point, this is not easy, but this is the straightforward path would be to go and do a postdoc. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I realized, I think that hadn't really, that would require less thought on my part, to go into that role, because there is an established path there. So I actually decided to take 6 months off, and I disappeared to South America, and I decided to use that time to write down exactly what I wanted from a job. And it didn't matter how long that took. I just wanted to come out with 5 or 6 different requirements, and then go about looking for a job. And I think actually that as a kind of pre-step, that was really important, because then when I came back, I really knew what it was I wanted, and I was able to focus my attention on exactly where I was going to apply. And then, like Emma, I'd actually met someone who was a patent attorney previously, so it became clear quite soon that role ticked quite a lot of my requirements. And so I emailed her, and she was extremely helpful in pointing out some useful resources. There aren't too many available with patent law, but there are a couple of web-based resources. One is, I think it was called Inside Careers, but has now migrated to ipcareers.co.uk, and that was great. That's a really good website. Also, CIPA, which is the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys, which also has a website with lots of useful information. So that was very helpful. In terms of the practicality of actually applying, firms don't. Well, it depends who you're applying for. I guess there are 2 strands to the job, really. One, you could go into private practice like I did, and that's where you work for a company which would work with a range of different clients, or often corporate entities, so big pharmaceutical companies, that sort of thing, would employ a patent attorney or a team of patent attorneys in-house, So you could take either of those routes, and I guess the recruitment, the practicalities of recruitment would depend on which of those routes you took. In private practice, they don't generally tend to recruit in cohorts, so you don't have to hit a particular time of year or anything like that. I just ended up sending, what seemed like hundreds of letters off to speculatively off to firms, and then perhaps only getting one or two replies. But that's kind of how it worked.
I think we can all relate to sending hundreds of letters out there and getting few replies back. But that's kind of what you have to do if you're taking the sort of unconventional route somewhere. That I think that's what my advice would be. Just keep applying and keep at it. So another question that this is a different workday from going into lab and doing your experiments and coming back home either before joy of something having worked or like absolute despair that something you've been working on for a week didn't work out. But what does a typical workday look like for everybody in their current positions? Emma, do you want to start off?
I'm going to say a typical day. Basically, I sit in an office in front of a computer for most of it. We might have a few meetings, either sort of amongst our features team to discuss what we're working on this week, or with other teams in eLife on like sort of cross-departmental projects. But on a typical day, I probably work on probably like 3 or 4 different articles of varying lengths. So I might work on a couple of the digest, the little summaries that we do of the research articles. I might have a longer feature article that I might be editing into shape. I might even be sort of sorting out peer reviews for some of the feature articles. Every day is like very different, but it's sort of, at its core, it's probably emailing people, looking at words on a page and trying to make them better. And yeah, that's probably it. It's more exciting than it sounds, I swear.
No, I can attest to that. That's very similar to what my workday would look like. It's a lot of emailing people, and I sometimes have to talk to a lot of the different scientists over the phone. It's a lot of exchange of ideas about like, does their research fit in with the scope of the journal? It's a lot of staring at pages of text and making sure that everything's in order. But apart from that, it also involves like sometimes interactions with other sides of company life or publishing that I wouldn't have had in the past. I've ended up working a little more with marketing now, and that is an opportunity I wouldn't have had if I hadn't been in this current position. I also end up writing for the blog at Jove, and that is again a privilege that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So there are things that sound maybe not so interesting, but overall it's a very interesting day. Really?
Yeah, so my day is very, very similar to a typical bench research day that you've had during your grad school or postdoc. You are working on one or more projects. You normally have your experiments planned. So you come in, you do your experiments. We still, we look at our data, put it in our PowerPoint, send it out to our collaborators. There's a lot of, you work in a really cross-functional team, so it's not like you can do the project on your own. You actually wouldn't really have either the time or the skill set that is required to do. So in those situations, you want to make sure you're communicating well with your colleagues, sharing data or asking them for their expertise if you need their help in designing or executing your experiments. So it does require a lot of emailing and very good communication skills to be able to perform such tasks. Besides that, if you're managing, you have a team that you manage, and you have people who are reporting to you like I do, then I'm also involved in helping them plan and execute experiments, training them. So that also takes up a big part of my day.
Ben, do you want to tell us about a typical day in Patenful?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it kind of depends what my time's taken up doing at the time, really, which is not really a particularly good answer. But I think it can vary. I'm often, so a lot of it is email based, like you guys. Whether most of it will be responding to, most of the day will be responding to instructions from clients, so or actually soliciting those instructions. So I mean, basically the job is to advise clients and on a route to take to help them protect their technologies. So often that means asking them what their commercial requirements are, and then figuring out a strategy to do that, and then putting that into practice. But day to day, I'd be answering emails from clients or associates who are based in other jurisdictions. So based in the US, for instance, if a client that I represent wants protection in the US, we would engage people who are essentially sort of my equivalent in the US to actually carry that out. So there'd be a lot of back and forth between me and the client, and me and perhaps one or more associates. So that would be the lion's share of the day, and then depending on what else is on the cards, if I was drafting a patent application, I'd have a lot of engagement with researchers like Ribu, and talking about how the invention works and what the essential requirements are and the limits of it, in order to define it properly and get a good search from the patent office. And then if it's an application that's already been filed, and I'm arguing with an examiner, it would be responding to essentially letters from the patent office, and arguing the toss with them over whether something should be granted in the first place, and perhaps talking with the client about potentially concessions that could be made on their part in terms of the scope of protection, in order to push the application through. And then if it's an already granted patent that's been attacked, or I'm defending it, then that generally means that I'm not in the office. I'm in essentially a courtroom in The Hague or Munich, and then essentially sort of standing up and making a fool of myself, trying to defend the thing or trying to attack it. So that's the sort of variety of things, but a lot of it is, I think someone once described it as glorified letter writing, which is probably a good description, I think.
Thank you so much for that, then. That I guess we all have very similar yet very different days.
Yeah.
So another thing that I would like to talk a little more about before I guess we get into questions from the audience is, what was one of the hardest adjustments that you had to make when you moved from bench science to your current role, even if that be industry science? Like, what was the hardest part, and also maybe what's like the best part about your current role? So I guess for me, one of the hardest things that I had to come to terms with is probably the sitting in front of a computer and the glorified letter writing part, I guess. It was a change, because like in a lab, I was used to running around doing experiments, and I was used to thinking about things a certain way and planning out my day a certain way. And that was just not applicable in any shape or form anymore. So I think I struggled with time management a little bit when I came into this position. I struggled with what should take priority over what, because this was something I was kind of learning as I went. And I think one of the best things about my current position is I get to decide what my day looks like. I have complete freedom in where I can carry out my work, mainly because it's mostly done on a computer. I can take it home with me if I wanted to. I can stay in the office if I wanted to. And but my absolute favorite part of my position is I have weekends. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people in lab can relate to. A lot of times there are no weekends, and that's just the nature of the beast. That's just how it is. But with my current position, I know now what weekends feel like, and I really enjoy that. So with that, hand off to Emma.
Yeah, I have to say, largely, those are the things I found as well. Yeah, 9 to 5 love having a job that I can leave at the end of the day and just not think about it anymore. It's so good. I mean, I didn't really feel many negatives actually about leaving research. It wasn't that I disliked research. I enjoyed doing the experiments, but the whole career thing, I was just glad to be gone, really. God, what was I going to say? There's something else. I've forgotten. I'm just delighted.
Great. Ribu, you still have bench work to do, so I'm sure there are different positives and negatives you bring to life.
Yeah, so actually some of the concerns that you shared are pretty much the same. When you are in academia and you're running a project, your time is your own and you are the sole person responsible for it. When you move to industry, you're working oftentimes in teams, and the experiments, at least the ones I deal with, can be very complicated and require multiple people. So learning how to manage your time becomes very critical, and to be able to do it so that you can work with the entire team, get your work done. Then the ability to prioritize, that's another very big important factor that I had to learn to do. What experiments need to be done first, what are later. Also, like, we have meetings and sometimes it can be difficult to, work around them. So that's another thing that I had to learn. Initially, it was very difficult. I would say somewhat challenging, but then I figured out how to do it. And I think the fourth thing, which is very different between academia and industry, is like the mindset. So this was a great example that was given to me by someone else, that let's say you're trying to synthesize a compound A, which goes and does something. You could spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is the best way to get to compound A and highest efficiency, highest yield. Whereas without really testing whether it goes and does what it is supposed to do. So if you're in industry, you would make some compound A, go and test what it does. And if it really is working the way you want it to work, then you can go back and figure out how to make it better or more efficient and how to increase the yield. So I think like somewhat the mindset is different, and it becomes very important when you're doing your experiments to understand what data is nice to have versus need to have to push your project forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Ben, do you want to tell us about what's good or bad about your job?
Yes, of course. So I think I felt a bit like Emma, that I wanted a job that I could that I could leave when I left the office, but that hasn't really materialized. I can't really leave it. I've just kind of exchanged one set of stresses for some other ones, I think. But the deadlines aspect of being a patent attorney is really critical. If you miss a deadline, that's it really. So I think some people can find that really stressful. And you're kind of, you're responsible for keeping up with those deadlines. And sometimes, so you're on the hook for the deadline, but you're not always in control of when you're going to get instructions from somebody else. So very often you're in the office. You can be in the office for long hours or quite late, which is not that different from a PhD or postdoc necessarily, but at least in that situation, you're in control of what you're doing and how quickly you're doing it. So that was a bit of a challenge. I think one of the other things that people struggle with is going from being largely independent and in charge of your day-to-day activities, and going from perhaps being, an authority on a particular technique, or, you've spent a few years actually honing your research skills and you're actually really good at it, to actually going to a situation where you can't actually even send an email out without somebody looking over it. That because you're providing people with legal advice, and that can be quite a humbling experience. And so it can be quite challenging for PhDs and postdocs who've spent quite a lot of time working independently. There's no place for ego. You're essentially starting again, I think. And I think probably the final one is exams. I think you can't really get through a discussion about career in patent law without exams coming up at some stage or other. I mean, the flip side of learning all the time, which is great, is that you actually, in order to qualify, you're required to pass a series of professional exams. And these are foundation papers and advanced papers. And if you're working in Europe, that generally means you have to pass a set of papers which apply to whichever country you're in. So for me, it was the UK at the time. and then also a set of papers which allows you to practice in Europe. So it's a kind of like a two-tier set of exams. And so, I mean, you have to do foundations and and advanced papers. So I mean, that probably amounts to, I'd say, another 12 or so exams on top, from start to finish. And they're extremely difficult, so not to be taken lightly, I don't think. And most of the advanced papers are sort of 4 to 6 hours long. So they're pretty challenging. And the quickest you can, because you can only take each of the sets of the exams annually, the quickest you can probably qualify is about 5 years. Most qualified attorneys take between 5 and 7 years. It's not unusual to take longer. And all of that has to be managed alongside your work. So the hours can get quite long and it can be quite challenging. So I think that is not necessarily a disadvantage. If you know it's coming, it's fine, but it's certainly something that's important to consider beforehand, whether that's going to be for you, because it's a long haul to find out that you don't like it.
True. So I think we can answer questions from the audience.
Okay, so quite a lot of people are asking if you had any worries about not going back to academia, and if you can go back to academia after you've chosen an alternate career.
So I think for as an editor, any break that you take from academia will kind of be something you'll have to explain. But I think at least as an editor, I'm still tangentially related to academia, wherein I can say that, and it is true that I am involved in science. I'm still involved in the analysis of science. So I don't visualize it being too big of a problem if I decided to go back to academia at any time. And also my PhD, my expertise in my field, that's not going away. So I may have been out of touch, or out of the game, academic game for a little bit, but I don't visualize it being a big problem. But different positions will have different stories to tell here. Emma, do you want to add something?
I remember sort of when I took the job at eLife, my PhD supervisor sort of sat down with me and he said, think hard. There's some careers that you can go into at any time, and some careers that if you leave, you can't go back into. Which again, I disagree. In fact, at eLife, we just had someone who's just gone back into academia after a year, sort of working with us, sort of doing some community management stuff. So it's definitely possible to return.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't see the challenge or any issues arising. So as a I'm a scientist in the industry. I'm still doing research. So as you said, I don't think my skills are outdated. So I don't really see that as being a problem. But I think I think this sort of a fear is very natural when you're thinking of leaving academia and moving somewhere else, because you've just spent so much time being in academia. And I would say, don't be afraid to make a career change, because unless you try it, you not know whether you're going to enjoy it or not enjoy it.
Ben?
Yeah, I would agree with the other participants. Actually, I think don't be afraid of it. I think it's not going to go. Your experience thus far is not going to go away. I think particularly in my case, I've learned a lot of new skills which I think actually would be applicable, although I probably didn't know that at the time. So I think don't be afraid of it, and you can always. I think you can always go back. I don't really see a problem with that.
So the next question, did any of you have any restrictions on where you could take a position? And if so, how did that affect your job search?
Well, I mean, I think when I was looking for positions, I was looking at two things. I either wanted to go into industry science, or I was looking at the editorial aspects of different journals. So those were pretty much my only restrictions, and I applied. I sent out a lot of applications for both of those career opportunities. So I don't think I had a lot of restrictions. that I was keeping in mind, but I do remember that Ben was very specific about what he was looking for. So maybe he'll be the best person to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what's meant by restrictions, but I mean, I had a series of specific requirements, but that was mainly in terms of the type of job I was looking for rather than necessarily location or anything like that. So I mean, I was kind of open to moving anywhere really to get any kind of different experience if that was available. So I think being as open as you possibly can to any kind of change is always a good thing. But because often you find that you make decisions which you're not necessarily expecting to make in the first place, and they turn out to be very good. So I'd be as open as I possibly could. But in terms of restrictions, not really. But I don't know if that would be true across people in patent law. I think if you're applying for a job in the UK, I specifically looked at London firms because that was mainly because it was a risk mitigation strategy on my part. I knew that most of the patent law firms in the UK were based or had at least had an office in London, and I thought if I ended up getting a job with one of those firms and I didn't particularly enjoy the work environment, but I enjoyed the job, then I could potentially move between firms relatively easily. Whereas if I moved to an office which was based in I don't know in the north of England, which is kind of where I grew up, and then perhaps the opportunities to change would perhaps be more limited. So that was a consideration. I'm not quite sure that answers the question, but
Ribu, any restrictions
So-
on working with?
So I'm also not sure what they mean by restrictions, but there's just a couple of things I would like to say. So one, I agree with Ben's. When I was looking for positions, both for my postdoc and for my career outside of academia, I looked in big cities because there were more labs. So if I didn't like the lab I joined, I could go to a different lab, or if I didn't like the company I started with, there were a lot of jobs around. And so that didn't mean I had to relocate in case something didn't work out. And then the other thing that I'd like to say is that I'm curious, like what the person means by restrictions. But it's very important when you're looking for these jobs to know what you want to do next, because that will help you decide what sort of positions you want to apply for and where are the jobs located, and if you want to move into those into that career direction as well as in that area.
Emma, any restrictions?
Yeah, so I didn't really have time long enough to think about restrictions. I didn't really have any at the time. But sort of follow on from what Ruby said there. Yeah, thinking about where you're going next, I was prepared, if I hadn't got this job, to possibly sort of spend a year or so maybe commuting to London from Cambridge every day, maybe taking on like quite a low-paid internship, sort of with the idea of just getting experience that would allow me to go into editing. And that would have been like quite hard, I think. I don't know if I would have actually been able to do it for a whole year, but I would certainly have to cut back on other things in my life to progress my career if it has been necessary.
Thanks.
Another question quite a lot of people are asking is about does a short postdoc look poor on your CV, or because it indicates that you have less pre-publication or completion of a project, and will that help or affect your job prospects in any way?
I did a very, very short postdoc, probably about 6 months or so. And I don't think that worked against me. I basically had realized maybe during my last year of my PhD or sometime during that postdoc that I did not want to be in academic science anymore. So once you've made that realization, I don't think it works against you, because you would want to, whenever you're interviewing with your potential employer, the good thing about it is that you actually came to that realization and you took steps in order to move your career in the direction that you wanted to move it into. You didn't sit back and spend a year in the postdoc instead of actually doing what you wanted to do. So I think that that is a positive rather than negative. But I mean, that has been my experience with a short postdoc. I don't know if other people have something else to add there with their postdoc experiences, the length time, if that affected their job prospects in any way.
Yeah, so I can give you my 2 cents on it because I did a 2-year postdoc, and when I moved to the industry, I did not have a paper from my postdoc. So this was definitely a question that I had, whether it will, if I leave the postdoc early, will it look bad on me? Will it show that I can't take a project to completion, or will I appear as a job hopper? But as Indrani said, when I spoke to other people, it became very clear to me that if staying in my postdoc was something that I did not want to do, then it was better to make the move as soon as you start having this realization. And the second thing to think about is, if you are again stuck in a dead-end project where you don't think you're going to get a paper, then I think it's better to move earlier than later. And the last thing to think about is the kind of job you're applying. If you think you already have a skill set and there is a job out there that you are your skills are very complementary to, I would recommend that you apply for those positions and see what happens.
Thank you. Emma, Ben, your thoughts?
Nothing to add.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I didn't do a postdoc, but I would say that I would agree that, you know, generally it's a positive thing to recognise that you didn't necessarily want to do it early. I think also most people would recognise that you learn most from a new position in the first few months of being there. So, I mean, sticking around, you perhaps, you know, your return on that initial investment is probably decreasing as you go. So I think it's probably a good thing that you recognise it early. You probably know enough by that stage to know that you don't necessarily want to pursue it. And certainly in terms of qualification for patent law in the biotech area, you would almost certainly need a PhD, but a postdoc isn't necessarily a requirement. So if you're on the fence about doing one in the first place, then it's not going to harm your prospects if you don't have one, certainly. So yeah, that's all I would add, I think.
Yeah, I think recently I've also noticed a lot of people are moving directly after PhD into industry positions, and they may or may not have postdoc experience or very short experience. So I'm not sure. I don't think not having a postdoc experience or a short postdoc experience would count against you. I think it would count positively, like everybody else said, that you've realized that you want to move to a different career direction, and then you're acting on it.
One
last question before we finish. So people were wondering if there were any courses any of you took in editing or publishing that helped you get into a career outside of academia?
So I did take a course, which is, I'm not sure, I mean, it did make my resume a little stronger, but I'm not sure that it's a requirement. But there is a course available on Coursera that I took, which is about writing and editing, exactly. And I did enjoy it a lot, and I do think that it helped my resume appear stronger. But one of the things that I do recommend for people who are trying to break into this position is do peer review articles. As once you're done with the PhD, do go ahead and peer review articles, because that counts. That experience, I think, counted more than the course, but I can recommend that course on Coursera.
Nani, can you comment on, like, how did you get those peer review articles? How did
sorry.
Out? I think that would be
just reach out to journals and offer yourself up as a peer reviewer. Pretty much, I think everybody does it more or less. You can reach out to journals, hand over your CV, and offer up yourself and your expertise as a peer reviewer. And whenever they find an article that comes around which matches your field and your expertise, they'll reach out to you. And once a journal is comfortable enough and knows that you are a good peer reviewer for them, you'll get more and more manuscripts from those specific journals too. I think that getting the first manuscript from a journal is the hardest part. But yeah, just reach out to different journals in your field and just offer your services as peer reviewers. Ruby, you have some experience here. So.
Yeah, so I also peer reviewed for many journals, and I just wrote to them. I really enjoyed doing it. It was a good way, personally, for me to learn about different science, which is not the exact project that you're working on. And yeah, you write to a lot of journals. It's hard to get the first paper to review, like Indrani said, but after that, it gets easier.
Emma, any coursework that you took?
No, I didn't do any formal courses. I did a few sort of, my university did a couple of sort of science communication courses that I found useful. That was more face-to-face. I would really say I think the most valuable thing if you want to write about science is just to practice it and get the experience.
Yep. I think that's all the time we have today. So thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
And bye.